Welcome back to the Family Ties podcast. My name is Julia Avery, and this is my sister and co-host.
Hi guys, Kelley here. I'm excited to announce that I woke up this morning and left the house, and it was 50 degrees outside, and I was able to put on the first sweater of the season. So that was exciting, and I haven't stopped grinning ever since. So we're in my favorite season. We're good to go. So I would like to go ahead and welcome our guest this week, which is Brad Onishi. He is the Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Skidmore College, as well as one of the co-hosts on my new favorite podcast, Straight White American Jesus. Thank you, Brad, for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It's really kind for the invitation. It's really kind that you're listening to the show. So thank you for that too.
Absolutely. I've been kind of bouncing around a lot since a few weeks ago. A previous homeschool person that we grew up with recommended your show. He went to school with you, I believe. Lucas McLaughlin.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Yeah. He was like, you guys totally need to be listening to this. And I was like, I wrote him a big thank you note. I was like, that was the best suggestion ever. Thank you so much.
That's great.
So
I did. Yeah. Yeah, very good. He's all the way over in the UK still.
Yeah, I haven't really kept up with them a ton, but we grew up sledding on the hill in their backyard as kids. Yep. So we grew up with them, and they're fantastic. So
yeah. Good.
I think the last time I really saw them, I was probably around 7 to 10 years old, but I remember the best memories with them and their family. I remember New Year's, spending New Year's Eve with them, watching the figure skating on TV, the figure skating competition, and them doing pottery. And I was like, I really wish I was in this family.
No offense, Mom and Dad. Anyways, so the premise to this is that we grew up homeschooled in very rural Kentucky, and it took me until I left for college to kind of start questioning anything that I grew up being taught. We were very tucked away from society. Our parents fully mistrusted the government. We were a part of this Quiverfull Movement, and I was fully entrenched in trying to be everything that I was taught. I mean, we went to boot camps.
Just constantly seeking approval.
Yeah, boot camps at Precept Ministry, where you're learning inductive Bible study. I constantly felt like a fraud because in my heart, I just had all of these questions, and I just felt like it doesn't matter how many times I try to be what they want me to be. I'm always questioning, am I truly saved? All of these questions, my mom would always tell me, are you really saved? Are you sure? And I think I kind of had that, I was saved so many times. And each time I was like, well, did this time do the trick?
I was the same way. And I felt like for the longest time that it was, I was definitely a fraud because I was bisexual without understanding what that was. And Kate Winslet, when we were watching what our parents thought was a safe movie, Sense and Sensibility, I fell in love with Kate Winslet, not Willoughby. And I knew to be quiet about that, but I didn't understand. So I've been a fraud my entire life. So. To my parents.
So I was very encouraged to listen to your podcast, Brad, and hear about you guys and your journey of being in this community as well. And, that there is light at the other side. I don't know about where I stand with my particular faith. I respect people who have it, but I am increasingly becoming questioning of absolutely everything. And this is where you come in, Brad, with your your educational background and the fact that you've studied this so in depth. What is your view of the homeschool community? Have you had a lot of experience with that back in your evangelical days?
I did. I was, so for folks who don't know, I grew up in Orange County, California County, so kind of right on the border of LA County. A lot of folks envision California as this leftist place, very radical politics, and this is where all the progressive things come from, politically and culturally. It's actually not true. California is very heterogeneous, and there's incredibly large swaths of conservative communities and regions. And so Orange County at the time, when I was growing up, was really country, bush country. It had been Goldwater country. So the marriage of the religious right and conservative politics really took off in County, California in ways that I explore on our series, The Orange Wave. And along with that went homeschooling movements and Christian day school movements. So one of the first big fights, the Christian schooling movement came in California in 1968. And during that time, there was some of the first comprehensive sex education curricula being implemented in schools. And that had happened about early 60s, but for some reason in 1968, some parents got really upset and controversy and started spreading the rumors, along with the John Birch Society and others, that the curriculum included teachers taking their clothes off to show students the human anatomy, teaching children that it was totally fine to have sex with animals, and the conspiracies just, went from there, right?
Wow.
And so when I grew up, there was a lot of, right in Orange County, I mean, I'm talking 30 miles from LA, there's, we live 20 minutes from the beach, a lot of people in Hawaiian shirts and LA lifestyles. And yet where I grew up, there was a lot of Christian schooling going on. There were homes and there were a lot of just Christian academies in general. So anyway, that's my personal experience. There's a lot of the government in Orange County. There's a lot of sort of painting the government as the enemy. And that, as you all know, plays right into this whole movement, the Quiverfull Movement, as well as the homeschooling movement. So all of those elements were there in my own experience. Because I was a convert, because my family was not part of evangelicalism, I went to public school my whole life. So I had kind of a different, I was the kid at school walking around with tracts, asking people if they knew Jesus and leading a Bible study, and that kid, rather than an experience like yours where I was homeschooled or in a Christian school. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, what you said is very interesting about the 1960s in Orange County. When we spoke with Rachel Coleman last week, she's the founder of the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, and she was talking about her thesis study being about the history of how we went from being Christians who sat in pews being totally fine with public schools to the point at which they were no longer okay with it. And it being about, how public schools used to be seen as like tools for educating all of the immigrants. But when that kind of clamped down, then it became, when they were trying to desegregate schools, that's when she noticed that these private schools, these Christian schools, and these homeschools really took off. And then the zenith in the 80s was kind of when I, kind of was introduced to it. And our family kind of yanked my two older sisters out of school. And we were homeschooled from then on out. So I feel like this progression, this timeline is becoming more and more interesting for me to kind of pick apart.
That's right. And I think at it is this: in the 1960s, you have a couple of elements coming together. So in one is the one you mentioned, is desegregation. So one of the things we've tried to do on our show is to spend hours explaining how the rise of the religious right in this country did not happen as a result of opposition to abortion. It's just historically not true. The 1960s, from concerns over segregation and concerns over churches and schools tax exempt status because they had official segregation policies. Mm-hmm. So the fear of segregation, the fear of desegregated schools, the fear of losing tax exempt status if you're a segregation institution, this is really what gets going the religious right. So race is front and center. I mean, I always say the white and white evangelical is the most important part. Mm-hmm. What's also happening is people are teaching the theory of evolution in schools. This is actually a weird fallout from the Cold War. So we're trying to get to the moon. We got an army of scientists. How do we do that? We bulk our science programs. That includes evolution. there you go. As I mentioned, there was sex ed, and the sex ed curricula that go in the 60s led a lot of folks out of public schools. And again, all those rumors about ridiculous conspiracies regarding what was being taught, to many people wanting to pull out of public schools. And then finally, there was the court cases. So there's 2 court cases in the 60s, Engel versus Vital, etc. And this is when prayer is no longer happening in school, right? It's no longer allowed to be part of the curriculum, and Bible reading as well. So that's just that's the easiest thing to if you're, trying to politic public schools. Look at this. We got out of schools. It's a godless nation. It's a godless institution. Get your kids out of there because they're going to be, brainwashed, et cetera. What happens from the 60s to the 80s is just this consistent lobby to get oversight of homeschooling taken away, right? So there's so much lobbying to make it so that anyone can homeschool. There's no regulations, no laws, and very little oversight. And that lobby is very powerful, and it really leads to where we are now today, where if you're homeschooling, you don't have to turn in test scores. There's not very many standards to follow. You don't have to really report. You don't really have to have, as a parent, you don't have to have certification. That's a very strange place to be in, if you ask me, in terms of having tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of kids being schooled in our country along those lines. But they're all a direct result of these things that started in the 60s and then the 80s, and here we are today.
Well, and it's super interesting to me because the way we were taught to mistrust the government is going to come after us, there's a war against the family. I think what strikes me the most is how much people like groups like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association is able to whip up their base into a froth to where no common sense laws can be passed. And to me, the thing is that if you are teaching your children, if you are doing what you should be doing, why are you afraid of submitting these things? And it's just this fear-based mentality that we were taught to run inside if we saw someone coming down the driveway. No one needed to know that we were not in school. School wasn't taking place. And the fact that social services were called on our family several times, HSLDA made it to where they could never investigate anything. And I don't know about Julia, but I was self-taught in high school. It is a miracle that I was able to I
self-taught from 6th grade up.
To take the ACT. The reason I was able to take it and go to college was because not just determination, but my oldest sister, I think there was some kind of fire burning in her that I'm still amazed to this day. She knew that that's not where she wanted to be. And she went ahead, even without any of the tools, she figured it out. She took the test, she went to college, and she is the only reason that I passed that test to get into Western Kentucky. And so I find it really interesting that I'm learning all of these stories from like the invisibleChildren.org of this being super commonplace, because I told someone very close to me recently my story, and they're like, well, that's just not typical.
And it's not just that person, like people that I've told in the past, because they're like, wait, so you said you were homeschooled? What was that like? And I'll start to tell them and they're like, wait, what? Mm-hmm. I've never heard of that before. And I'm like, yeah. And then so many people think that this is like we're an anomaly, and we are not. And then looking deeper into this and finding more stories that have just been,
horrific,
brushed under the rug, they're more commonplace than any of us thought before. It's crazy.
I think a couple things there. I think one, generally, what I have found in just being part, my own deconstruction from evangelicalism and being part of work with folks, in the ex-evangelical kind of broad, category, there's just so much shame that you feel, and such a sense of like being different, right? So, for me, I did not have your experience, but I certainly was all in. I was a minister by the time I was 20. I married my high school sweetheart when I was 20. My whole life was dedicated to the movement. When I emerged from that, it's really hard to like be 20 years old and exist, in what you consider mainstream society, and everyone's talking about their experience when they were 17, or the movies they watched, or the things they did, and you're sitting here thinking they're all smoking cigarettes, and you're like, I've never smoked it. I have no idea how to do that. What's going to happen if they offer me one? Well, you know what I mean? And that's a really stupid example. Like, who cares? But those things pile up to the point where you're like, I feel like I'm weird. I feel like I'm different. I feel like I have to cover up the fact that my experiences as an adolescent and a young adult are so drastically different from other people. And you convince yourself you're the only one. You can convince yourself that you kind of just have to maneuver around it. Like it's a part of you that you want to try to not let out of the bag too quickly if you meet a new friend or, you know, dating someone or whatever it is. And
try to hide those issues. You're like, I'm not crazy.
Yeah, exactly. No, and that's exactly it. I mean, you know, you like trying to ask yourself, when is the right time to tell someone who, like, date number 3? Hey, guess what? Here's my life. And so it's a thing. And so if you add that layer for both of you, the homeschooling element, that's just one more layer of this, where you feel like you're very, as you said, anomalous, but in fact, there's so many people out there with these experiences. And the last thing I'll say here, and just is we need to find ways to form those communities. I think what happens is not only do you have shame and confusion when you leave, but you feel a sense of like you're now in the desert alone, right? Like your life used to be full of community, family, and just saturated with relationships. And now you're on the outside and all those people are shunning you and you don't know where to go. You don't know how to build your sense of who you are with other folks. And so it just sort of like snowballs, right? And I just think that's why these, you know, your show and everyone like this is so important, because we're trying to find each other and help each other and really sort of help anyone else who needs it to make their way.
Well, and I'm curious. Oh, go ahead, Julia. You first.
Okay, so this might be really loaded. We could discuss this at a later time, whatever. But I've been watching The Vow on HBO, and it's about NXIVM's cult. And just seeing how hard it is to get out of a cult, and just how the community that they develop when everybody's of the like mind is set, and it starts out feeling like everybody's doing this for a good reason, and they have good intentions, and then it just starts to get in really deep, and they're very controlling on, you know, what ideas or concepts people have. I have a very unpopular opinion that just organized religion, period, including especially Christianity, it has a very cult-like mentality, and it makes it very difficult for people to get out and find a sense of community again. I feel like a lot of people feel lost even within their communities because they're afraid to say something that's unpopular or whatever. So watching that has like really brought a lot of those thoughts.
Yeah. You know, what I was thinking of as you were explaining that is that a community like NXIVM, but also a community like yours, a Quiverfull community, and many other evangelical communities, they're really there's a lot of words we can use, but they're saturating communities. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is they demand that every relationship you have be within the group, right? Yes. So your schooling, your family, your friends, your courting or dating or whatever it's called in that group, your ideas, your hopes for the future, your job prospects, your ideas of what the good life is and the right life, your politics, your cultural references, media. So what happens then? Okay, so they demand this full attention, this absolute saturation of your life. That's different than somebody who, like my co-host Dan. My co-host Dan is an ex-evangelical, but he continues to identify as a Christian. He goes to church on Sundays. It's a very liberal, Protestant church, LGBT affirming, Black Lives Matter flag kind of church, right? Everyone there has a different politics. They argue over issues, important issues, right? Related to everything from climate change to local issues, right? That community doesn't demand uniformity, and it doesn't demand saturation.
That's refreshing.
If you ask Dan, he's like, hey, I have my church, but my church knows that I'm part of this queer families coalition because we have a queer family. So that's a huge part of my life too. Like I go camping queer families, and we go on picnics and we do stuff with them. And I have, and you know, what he does on our shows, he talks about all the different communities and groups that sort of he participates in. And
that's so healthy. I love that.
It's so different than our experience, right? Where everything you do and everything you are is consumed. And so the flip side of this is, why is deconstruction so hard? It's because, look, from the time I'm an adolescent, I'm told the government's out to get me. If I have sex before marriage, my life will be irrevocably harmed, and nothing will ever be the same. My life is up to the Lord's will, and so I need to sort of figure out my profession according to those lines. In terms of Quiverfull, if we want to talk about Quiverfull, it's like, well, however many children God wants me to have, I'll have. So that could be 6 or 10. Well, so we'll just see what happens there.
Raising Christian armies. That's what it was always referred to growing up. Yeah. Like this is our Christian army. These are our Christian soldiers. Our kids are Christian soldiers. And it was like, that's scary.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have the tool in the world and just be someone. You have to fully reinvent who you are. And that it's scary. It's hard. It's excruciating. And it's often lonely is the worst part.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and for our listeners who may not know exactly what the Quiverfull Movement is, I'm a little late to the game in giving you Wikipedia's description, but it's a theological position which is held by some conservative Christian couples who belong to various Christian denominations, which see children as blessings from God, and it encourages procreation, abstaining from all forms of birth control, including natural family planning and sterilization. So it's very widespread in the U.S., but it has some places in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand and the United Kingdom and elsewhere. But I mean, it's not like it's a huge subset of people. I don't think that that's what I'm trying to say at all. But I think what I really wanted to get your opinion on, Brad, is the question of, okay, so we have these groups, and a lot of the normal people out there listening don't know about these groups, don't know they exist really. But most importantly, they don't know how much power that they hold in our political system and in their communities, which cause there to be this chain reaction of no common sense laws being able to be passed. They are strong and they are powerful. And I don't want that to be something that we miss here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think that's exactly right. So couple comments along those lines. You mentioned the HSLDA and all the work that y'all have done to sort of explore that already. That can't be overstated, right? So the HSLDA is a unified lobbying group that has a radical stance on homeschooling as a unregulated space in our educational ecosystem. So if you hint as a local politician, right, at common sense reform, if you hint as a state legislator, if you hint as a representative to Congress, whoever you are, if you even broach the topic, there's no debate, no dialogue, no good faith argument, no let's sit down and really see where each other are coming from. The HSLDA has an army. They're going to come for you, and they're going to do everything to ruin your political career if you even hint at trying to regulate homeschooling in any way. One of the things I want to get across is that's not unique in this religious cosmos. So if you read a book by Ann Nelson called Shadow Network, we have a whole episode of our Orange Wave series, Orange Wave, the episode titled "It's Not Democracy, It's War." What we learn from that kind of exploration is that there are dozens of the religious rights organizations in American politics, and they are organized from the most local of levels, the board, all the way to the mayor, all the way to the state legislator, all the way to the representative, all the way to the Ted Cruz's and the Marco Rubios and whoever else is running at the national level. They have completely outwitted and outstrategized their political opponents on those levels. And they see it as and you all know this from the homeschooling movement and the Quiverfull movement. They don't see it as a short-term thing. It's not hey, we need to fix this thing in 2 years. It's we're building an army. It's going to take generations, but we're going to take this country back for God, and we're going to do it in a militant way that is uncompromising and without any debate or dialogue about how to do it. That, in essence, is the context for the HSLDA and the homeschooling movements. Quiverfull, which is usually the Quiverfull movement usually includes homeschooling, and so it's all part of that huge sort of network. What Ann Nelson calls the shadow network of the religious right, and it's when you start looking into it, it's pretty overwhelming and somewhat discouraging. So
yeah, I see that having a huge impact when it comes to LGBTQ rights, in
Women's productive
law.
Rights.
Women's productive rights, yeah, and
Most
then
importantly.
and then issues relating to like how we respond to rape or assault. Those issues as well, like even like legally, as well as the stigma around women that come forward with that kind of stuff just because of the way they've treated sex.
Well, Julia, I think, is referring to this in relation to the Duggar family and what happened with their oldest son, and how we grew up with a similar type of story, for what that's worth. And so the way we were raised as women, that it is our responsibility to not be temptations of any kind, and that if any kind of attention was sent our way, it was our fault because we had allowed it to happen, B, encouraged it, and somehow it had to do with what we were wearing, how we were walking, and how those thoughts are still prevalent. Like,
Even if you're
shocking
a child and you don't even know what's going on, you're still responsible.
that it's our responsibility as women to control the urges of men. And I've heard you guys talk about that as well on the show.
Oh yeah, no, to me that, the political stuff we just talked about, this is where it touches, it's all interwoven with two things. One, a thoroughly patriarchal understanding of sex and authority, right? So are just by nature, they're supposed to be the leaders, right? But here's the weird paradox of all this, is that the ideology and the way of life that you all just outlined paints men as these weaklings who are unable to resist their sexual urges, right? So in one breath, you're like, men are in charge. That's how God did it. Sorry. On the other hand, right? We have this admission that, men are just weak. They're so sexual, they can never resist. So they're kind of a liability, y'all. Sorry about that. And guess what that means, ladies? You'll never be in charge or have any authority or be in a place of leadership, but you might be 11 years old and you need to be aware that you're the one who's the gatekeeper of purity. So the patriarchal stuff meets the purity stuff. And the purity culture says, if you give temptation in any way, your life will be marked. And, ladies, you're the ones who are responsible for being the gatekeepers there. So men are not naturally the type to marry or to be monogamous, and they're just these sexual savages running the earth who be controlled. And you know what you need to do? Woo them into a marriage that is blessed by God. Ensure that you're not tempting anyone else in any way at any time by the way you dress or walk or talk or do your hair or blah, blah, blah. And then that's how we're going to do it. So, it's a great spot in life. Your goal is to have all the children to be policing all the time, everyone's sexual urges, be the gatekeeper of all that, all the while knowing you'll never be in leadership or recognized as an authority in the community. So sounds amazing.
And then men get away, even with sex being viewed as so heinous. Men somehow still in that realm of beliefs, they still get away with being with many people. But you as a woman are with someone before marriage, one person before marriage. You may marry them, and you're still considered like, there's still that stigma attached to you because you're female.
Yeah. No, I was going to say my students asked me about, they asked me the Duggar case specifically 4 years ago. And, these are students who are coming mainly from secular backgrounds, and they're just like, hey, I don't get it. Like, you just told me that evangelicals and conservative Christians are really against sex before marriage. So the Duggar brother assaults one of his sisters, and he's immediately forgiven and brought back into the fold. How does that work? And the way that works is, look, we already told you men are sexual savages. So they're going to mess up. And as long as they say sorry, we'll forgive them because that's who they are. Boys will be boys. women are not sexual. If you're a woman and you have an assertive sexuality, if you're a woman and you are a sexual being in an independent way, you might be mentally ill. I mean, you're certainly not right with the Lord. And so if you're the one messing up, you're the one with someone before marriage, or you're the one with multiple partners, or whatever it is, you don't have a heteronormative sexuality. It's really hard to look at you as a virtuous person that we can trust. By nature, women aren't supposed to be those folks. So if you're a woman and you fall into that category, you're immediately Eve the temptress, you're immediately Mary Magdalene, and you're sort of painted with this scarlet letter. Whereas men, even in the case, right, even in the Duggar case, where it's sexual assault against a sibling, you can be forgiven. Worse. Yeah, it's heinous. It's heinous, right? And my students are asking me like, Onishi, I don't get it. You're telling me two gay men or lesbian women or whoever it is can have consensual, loving relationship, and that's shunned by God and terrible. And yet this assaults his sister, and within months he's forgiven and totally back in the fold, and we're all good. Let's go forward, right? And my answer is like, categorically within the system, yes, within the Duggar guy can be, because it makes sense within the system. The gay person, the lesbian person, the bi person, the queer person in general has no place in the system. There's no category for them. So, and that includes the sexual woman, the independent sexual woman, right? There's no category for them. So they're sort of either unforgiven or banished or shamed to the point of surrender. So it's not a healthy place to be.
No. And one thing I wanted to share is this is kind of the way that we grew up. Is my best friend and I would have sleepovers at her house, and anytime we woke up in the morning, we would seriously have to take the newspaper that came in, and we would have to cut out any images that were in the advertising sections that showed women in underwear, in sleeping wear, or anything that involved a woman who wasn't fully dressed head to toe, before her dad could look at it. And I found that baffling, because I'm like, so where does he come into play? Where he has absolutely no power over his mind and his body. Like that is when I first started to question. I was like, this is really insane.
How do they handle the internet now?
Well, I mean, it's if we analyze what happened there, 2 8-year-old girls are tasked with the sexual policing of the community. These middle-aged men can't handle, somebody in an ad wearing a tank top or something, right? I mean, we had those in my youth group. The youth pastor would ask boys, okay, what are the things that girls wear that lead to temptation? And then he would go tell the girls, all right, the boy said these things lead to, and then we would have these awkward talks about it, in sometimes in separated groups, sometimes in all together. And it was cringy. It was super cringy. You look back on it and you just feel gross. You feel like kind of sexual ethics developing here, that men are just, as you're saying, Kelley, just that weak and unable to even sort of defend themselves from their urges or temptations or whatever we're calling them, that 2 8-year-old girls have to go cut the newspaper up before he can look at it.
I feel like that kind of conditioning is also the opposite than it's actually intended, because you're focusing even more attention on sex and temptations than perhaps normal society. And this is just me assuming, but with that, like our mom was always pressing these things, like always talking about the clothes, and it's like sex was constantly on the
even
mind.
Before we knew what it even was.
Right.
I mean, and that's the thing, is
like,
we would
have
have to
the opposite effect. Aren't we supposed to be like trying to remain pure, and then we're talking about, really, when you're talking about what are these temptations, honestly, it's a room full of people in a church talking about what turns them on. It's so weird to like.
Well, and the whole movement of I kissed dating goodbye, which I also heard on one of your early podcasts. I think it was the first episode I listened to, and I was like, everything these guys say is stuff that I grew up with and I know very deeply. But we had that book on our bookshelf, and the whole concept of courting, not dating. My oldest sister was never allowed to date, and I think she was in her mid-30s before she ever went out on her first date ever. And sorry to if she is upset that we say that, but it was just that so ingrained in us that a man would show up on our doorstep and just simply request our father's permission, and that is how it would be. So you just go about like praying, like, well, I hope he's nice, and hopefully he's somebody I would like.
And then that's another level right there, bringing up asking your father for you, and having like the fathers and the daughters have this weird relationship where they're your dad is the gatekeeper that have purity rings or purity vows with their fathers, and I'm like, that's none of their business. You guys shouldn't be. I don't know.
Well, and there's purity balls. So there's a ball you go to with your dad, and there's a in many ways there's like a reenactment of a wedding vow. So like the dad takes a vow to protect and shepherd his daughter at the event, and it is very strange. And we could talk for hours about the incoherencies of purity culture. As you were saying, Julia, you're doing everything you can to get 16-year-olds not to have sex. So what do? Just talk about sex every time you get together, right? Like a youth group and in family and in church and in like, hey, we don't want you guys to even be thinking about, what normal 16-year-olds do in terms of like flirting or kissing or I don't know, whatever it is. So we're just going to talk about this constantly so that, everyone can, as you said, talk about what turns them on and then do everything they can to suppress the images in the most unhealthy of ways. So,
and then I feel like that suppression also makes them act out more likely in the home or in their close environment that they're sheltered in, and I'm not
specifically speaking, Julia, you remember in the groups that we grew up in, it was always the boys that rebelled, that they had these, they were allowed to completely go off the rails and they had the most freedoms, whereas the girls were so tightly controlled. I never saw any of the girls cut loose. It was like they were always striving to be good enough, but the boys, it's like, even though they were given the car, they were given, they were allowed to get their licenses and given freedom to do things, it was always them that they were acting out, and it was so weird to see that dichotomy. I don't know.
It goes back, I think, to just if we build this system where men are both the unquestioned authority and also sexually unable to resist temptation, we build into it like one of the interviews I just did was with a colleague named Leslie Doro Smith, and she wrote about sex scandals and American Christianity. And what she argues there is, when a male, white, heterosexual politician has an affair, almost sometimes take it as a sign that he's a healthy man. And you know what? He's the kind of man who takes charge, he takes what he wants, and he's maybe the kind of guy we want leading our nation because we know that he has a good virility and vitality about him, right? And so there's ways that system that demonizes sex, and yet the gender norms and the conceptions of masculinity and femininity generate a situation where you almost expect men to be transgressive, to be violent, to be assaulting, to be inappropriate, to be illicit, cheating on their or whatever it is. And so, exactly as you said, Kelley, the boys are out, they have their licenses, and they might be doing things that aren't allowed in the community. The boys will be boys. And then, as you're saying, the girls are at home praying, and which man is going to show up at the doorstep, and maybe your dad will approve and maybe he won't. It's such a different experience and such a different set of expectations.
Can I then pivot that into asking you what you know of Bill Gothard and his teachings, because that was a huge, huge thing for the groups that we were in. and his own history with sexual abuse and surrounding himself with like a harem of young girls. What I forgot what his institute was called specifically.
So one of the I'll just say this. What to start is one of the most powerful interviews I've ever done is with a woman named Deirdre Sugiyuchi, and Deirdre was brought up in a home that was highly influenced by Bill Goddard's curriculum and ideas about, schooling and about, family, sexuality, the whole thing. And Deirdre's story exemplifies the damage that can be done in those settings, right? Like being sent to a Christian academy where sexual and physical abuse was rife, having it all covered up, having there be no oversight, having there be very little regulation, very little certification, very little spotlight shined on the dark corners of these places. And Bill Goddard has been at the forefront of this, right? The curricula, the teachings. This is somebody who's really working to create environments of schooling and academies, right, that are supposed to be part of these kind of very conservative, very purity-inspired, very anti-government kinds of spaces. And what's the flip side is that there's no oversight. There's no regulation. It's very hard to get a grasp on what's really going on there. And as you said, Goddard himself seems to fall into the categories I just talked about, right? The leader, the man who's up there and can't shut up about sexual purity and yet seems to also bear the marks of a man who is transgressing those norms. And that's highly, it seems contradictory, but it's not necessarily problematic within the community. And to me, that's one of the biggest incoherencies of this whole, of the nexus of homeschooling and purity movements and anti-government kind of curricula. Dominionist theology we should throw in there. Reconstructionist theology is another part of this. And so that's all sort of baked into this culture, and it's distressing, but it in some senses, if you investigate the logic of how this culture works, it makes why the male leader like Goddard can't be quiet about people being sexually inactive or pure or whatever it is, and yet seems to have histories and tendencies that belie that teaching at every turn.
Well, you see that cult-like, it is a very typical cultish thing to have this charismatic leader who, tells everybody that they, have to be pure. They can't look at someone else, but then they'll end up surrounding themselves with, whether it be the wives of other people within their control, or the rules never apply to them. And it's so interesting how people fall. I feel like the mindset of people who fall for these cults, that's a whole other topic of interest to me. But I think what I ultimately kind of want your opinion on in regard to these groups and how I started watching this documentary series on, or maybe it's just one show on Netflix called The Family, about how we've infiltrated government through with these leaders who have started the National Prayer Breakfast and things like that, and what they're trying to accomplish and how kind of insidious it is. I'm wondering, even though you have the Coalition for Responsible Homeschooling, we have these big limitations on what we're able to pass because we just don't have the money, the clout, or see the number of people to push energy into fighting with equal tenacity. Because what you talk about in regard to politics, Democrats, we want to play it so nice. We want to be so fair when the other side is cheating at every single turn, and we act surprised every single time. What is it going to take for us to match that power and match that kind of intensity? We have to get as aggressive. So what does that mean? How do we do that?
That's a great question and really important and massive. If I can just go back, so Goddard's, just so we know, we have it on the record. So Goddard started the Institute for Basic Life Principles, right, in the 80s. And started pretty quickly. So his brother Steve had to resign as part of the organization because he had multiple affairs with secretaries. And then Goddard himself resigned in 2014 because there was so many allegations of sexual harassment and molestation against him. Now, that didn't stop, the IBLP from really helping to form this culture surrounding homeschooling, security movement that y'all talked about in terms of gender roles for women, and sort of seeing the government as the enemy, right? Those three things really come together in the Goddard universe. And it's really hard to overstate how influential they've been. I mean, you all talk feeling like you were an anomaly, but hundreds of thousands of kids in our generation and still today were brought up on this sort of set of principles and these ideologies. I mean, I have a colleague who has a very similar history as yours. He was raised in San Diego. You think San Diego, California, liberal place or something? Almost the exact same sort of experience as you all in terms of homeschooling, what he was taught about the government, what he was taught about, to be a Christian, to not have any debt, to not be involved in the government in certain ways, to understand authority as the most important thing, blah, 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 right? So the next question is, well, what do you do to combat that, right? How do you sort of find ways to make inroads? And I think there's a couple of things. One, I think the first realization to combat despair is that there are so many more of us than them. If you read or listen to our episode with Robert Jones or Ryan Burge, it's very clear that the groups we're talking about, the religious right, white evangelicals, conservative Catholics, are like 15 to 20% of the country, right? And they're getting older and they're getting smaller because so many folks like us up in it are like, no, I'm good. I'm done now. So it's not a growing demographic. It's not like they're getting bigger. This is one reason that the Quiverfull Movement came about. It's like, how are we going to have an army that takes over America? We're going to have to give birth to it because it's not working in terms of evangelism and other things, right? So number one is there's so many more of us than them. That's number one. Number two is the organization has to happen at every level, right? So one of the things that happened under, for example, President Obama was this understanding of we have the first Black president, look at all the progress that's being made, and then he gets it elected, and immediately into the House and Congress really, everything goes Republican. Why? Complacency and a lack of attention to every level of political organizing, right? Well, that includes that includes homeschooling policies, that includes education reform, that includes all of this. So number one is there's more of us. Number two is I think organization is huge. And number three is just we have to find the rallying principle. Okay, so and this is the hardest point for me, is it's one thing to have a negative organizing force. We are all coming, what do we all share? We all share emerging from this evangelical or whatever, however you want to talk about it, movement. That's our shared commonality, right? On this interview, all on this podcast, and writ large when we talk about folks like us. Okay, that's great. And it's a really good way for us all to connect and talk about our experiences and help each other. That's really, really important. But if we're going to just have generational movements to combat all of these sinister things that we see in, for example, the homeschooling movement, the HSLDA, and so on and so forth, it has to be a long-term vision and a long-term unifying principle. Like what's what we're trying to tear down, but what are we trying to build up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
and
great.
I don't have the answer. I'm not going to sit here and give you my 45-point plan for that. But I think that is a next step. I think, when I think about evangelicals in the wake of Trump being elected, more and more of us sort of thinking like, we need to talk about this because this is a problem. People need to know, like we need to start podcasts. We need to write books, right? I think that's what we're all doing here. That's great. What we need to go from is a negative unifying force to a positive identification of we're not just tearing down. We're not just fighting to stop. We're trying to build something. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, you're right. Because that brings up a point where really, when we focus on just the negative unifying force, we have the same conversations. over and over and over again. We don't learn anything new. And we're just repeating something that everybody already knows. And we're not, like you're saying, we need to have that plan or an idea for the future and something that we want to build. So I love that. That's exactly right.
And I think like with people like Rachel Coleman last week, it was really nice to talk to her because we were sharing like our experience with homeschool. But I mean, like she says, when homeschooling is done right, it works well. But for the majority of the cases I've seen, it's not working. And that is because of the fact that we don't have rights for children. They had, like, until you're 18, you are pretty much your parents' property to do with what they see fit. And more importantly than that, I think the importance of places like the Coalition is to meet in the middle and be like, we're not trying to stop homeschooling. We're not against this. You guys on the other side with HSLDA, you guys are looking at us like we're enemies. And we had this conversation about how it's like we're like shepherds trying to get the sheep away from the cliff. And it's not that we're trying to push them off the cliff. We're trying to kind of protect it a little bit better. And if we could find a way to, as energetically as they do, talk about why it's important and why, we're not against homeschooling and we don't want to take your children away. That is not where we're coming from. There has to be a point at which we come to the table and come to some kind of constructive conversation, because it's always an us versus them kind of conversation. I don't feel like it needs to be. And that's what places like HSLDA.
I think things that, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please. Sorry.
I was going to say that's what places like HSLDA, they thrive off of, is the fear. It's the fear of otherness when, that's not what's a threat. That's not what's going on here.
I think one of the things that's baked into this equation is one side is using fear as an instinct. The other is using hope. Okay. So if you use fear, you have a pretty direct path to getting people behind you. I'm going to show up. I'm not going to give you a nuanced message. I'm not going to give you a complex message. I'm not going to give you a huge plan with a lot of detail. Here's what I'm going to say. You need to homeschool your kids because the government is evil. It's trying to destroy children. It's trying to indoctrinate them. They're teaching sex ed where bestiality and everything, pedophilia is encouraged. And if you don't do something about it, your family will be ruined, our country will be ruined, and God will not be happy. So you decide, go ahead. So that's one message. And it's like, oh my God, that's scary. Okay, I got to do this. And then if that's buttressed by my pastor said it, and all these people I respect said it, and my friends said it, okay, I guess that's what we got to do, right? What's the other side saying? The other side's like, hey, we're not against homeschooling. Parents, you have the rights to school your children. You want to be in charge of their education. We recognize it. Here's some regulations we'd like to see implemented, a plan that I think we think makes sense. And all of a sudden, you have the moral high ground when it comes to like coherency and rationality and thought. You don't have the direct access to that instinct, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do you craft messaging and a mission that is as powerful as we need to save the children. If we don't do this, the children will be the nation will be in danger. So you decide, right? That plays on an instinct that is so visceral. Okay.
Yeah.
How do you honor your principles and yet find messaging that can tap into a community sensibility in the same way? It's really hard. I mean, and these are just very broad examples, so please forgive me, but if you look at the election of Donald Trump, it was about fear. The nation is going to hell. There's American carnage. So I'm the one who can stop it. I'll protect you. I'm the viral savage man who's an adulterer and a sexual abuser. But you know what that says about me? I'll do anything it takes to protect you because I just take what I want. That was one way to do it. Obama's elected on hope. Hey, let's imagine a different country and a different future. Let's imagine a different way of living. You all imagine that with me? All right, that's how we're going to do it, everybody. Hope takes imagination. Hope takes coalescing. It's harder. It's more difficult. And yet it's so much more suited for human thriving and human flourishing, right? Sorry, long answer. I'm just trying to say what's baked into this equation, whether it's homeschooling, whether it's abortion, whether it's national security, whatever you want to talk about, if one is just going to appeal to brute fear and unapologetically peddle that, they're going to have an upper hand to start, and that's difficult.
That's true.
Yeah. And I agree. And to close this out, I kind of want to circle it around to politics, which is so near and dear to my heart. Just a little FYI to you, to me, the person I want leading our country, well, he's not on the ballot any longer. And when I look at someone like Bernie Sanders, I look at somebody like him and I think, well, according to the Christian values I was raised upon, this is the clear choice. This man has everyone's best interest at heart. He is doing nothing but striving to protect the least among us. And isn't that what we're supposed to care about? And of course, I'm not going to get my way for the second time in a row. And it's harder this time than it was last time, which I didn't think was possible. But even with a breaking heart, I realize the importance of us voting out someone that does nothing but prey more upon these fears, because our relationship to religious upbringing is based upon fear, guilt, and questioning of yourself constantly. And that has puts most of us into a very docile position to fall even further prey to the fear mongering that is taking place today. And I'm just wondering what it is about the religious right that can't see someone like Bernie as Christ-like. I mean, if you want to get down to it, so it's
I can see the exasperation on your face here. I wondered this exact same thing. I've wondered it for a long time. When I did the Orange Wave series, I wanted to figure that out in a way that related to my own and my home region and stuff. And what I discovered was a couple of really important things. One is that the religious right of the 1960s was constructed and designed by three. I mean, there's a bunch of folks, but there's three men. One is Paul Weyrich. Okay, Paul Weyrich is a conservative Catholic. He's not an evangelical. But in his mind, the most important thing is to take America back for God, and to do so in a way that fulfills where white patriarchal men are in control. They have families that are constructed along heterosexual lines with, as you just said, submissive or docile wives and children. The government has very little say in who and what they do, or in what they do, not who they do. Excuse me. And the other part of this then is a libertarian politics, right? That we need no regulation on our economics. We need to get the government out of our business because that is an infringement, right? So that vision is there. You couple that with all the racism. I mean, all the racism. It's all there from the beginning, okay? All of the fear of the other immigrant, the Black American, the brown American, the person who they deem not a real American, right? The person they dangerous or threatening to this order, the society based on patriarchal white that they want to build. Okay, so we got race, we got libertarian politics, we got a patriarchal vision. We need to keep women in line so that they understand their role. If you're Amy Coney Barrett, we can nominate you to the Supreme Court. Why? Because you're a patriarchal woman. Like, you totally are willing to play by the system's rules. Okay, so that's all there. And then what's the genius of this coalition? All right, so we know it's race, we want libertarian politics, we want a certain vision of the family. How do we get that going? We get it going through fear by way of children. So we're going to tell you that abortion is the Holocaust of babies. And so when it comes down to it, a lot of folks are going to wonder what you say, Kelley. Like, how did we get to a place where you're voting for Donald Trump over, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or whoever did, Cory Booker, all people of faith. Even Bernie says I'm an atheist, but I'm a Jewish person, right? So in some ways, people of faith. We get to a place where, well, look, that faith isn't real. There's no way you could be a person of faith if you're willing to take place in the Holocaust of unborn babies. So that's the way we're going to spin that. And then we're going to sort of talk about how you also want to destroy the family by allowing gay people to get married and trans people to have rights. And we're just going to build on these layers of fear when it comes to the most fundamental issues, when it comes to families and children, right? And that's how we're as an army. And then we're going to do that, and this is another part of Quiverfull that we haven't really got to, is that there is no neutrality. That everybody has a religion. And you may say, well, I'm not religious. And I'm going to say, well, that's your religion. You want to put humans in the place of God. You want to destroy Christians. You want to destroy God. You want to destroy faith in this country. So that's why someone like Donald Trump or Marco Rubio are telling you that Democrats to destroy faith and religion, even though I watched the Democratic National Convention. They couldn't shut up about God. I mean, Senator Coons is up there. Cory Booker's up there. You know, Joe Biden's up there talking about his son. I mean, Joe Biden goes to mass every Sunday. Elizabeth Warren's out here quoting Matthew 25 all the time. Pete Buttigieg is a person who won't be quiet about his faith. It was almost too Christian, right? And yet the message, socialism, market, godlessness, that's what they are, folks. Joe Biden, guy in his 70s walking around with gray hair, who's by all accounts, he's supposed to be a radical leftist Marxist who's going to tear down the country and not allow you to pray in your own home. Okay.
I see a lot of people like talking about the end times, and you know, for so long, like our mom thought Obama was the Antichrist. But like, I feel like that's also put into play, you know, with the fear mongering that you're talking about. It's almost like they also tie that into Revelations, and they're like, so you guys, this is even more serious now. You're now dealing with the end of times. You're dealing with these people that are wolves in sheep's clothing, saying the Bible, saying that they believe in God and all this to get you reeled in. So that's another attack on Democrats, because they're also like, they're already prepped to think that all these Democrats are only saying this because, you know, that's how they're going to reel us in. And then, you know, when it comes down to the gays, to pro-life or pro-choice, or, you know, those other issues, it's like everything's compounded onto climate change, even the end times. And this is where we really have to power up and do whatever it takes to keep those people from doing the Antichrist-ish, the whatever. I mean, like, it's just, I feel like that's all a lot of part of it too.
Well, and to me, it's a place where there's a fundamental incoherency, but nobody seems to care, right? So the incoherency to me is this: okay, God's in control. Jesus could return at any time, and so for that, okay, hey, let's do it. Who needs to go to college? I mean, this is how, if you met 16, 17-year-old me, I was like, who needs to go to college? Who needs to spend money on extraneous things? Let's spend all our money on tracts and gospel resources and tell everyone from Nepal to Colombia to the United States about Jesus. Let's do that, right? And then the response is, well, you know, that's important, but you know what we really need to do? We need to take over the PTA. We need to make sure that Congress is for us. We need to completely dominate state level and national politics and make sure that these folks have no say in their government. And if you exhaustively enough, and I'll just say, you realize it's about power. Mm-hmm. It's not about the end times. It's not about, like, if Jesus can come back any moment, then why is Mike Pompeo Secretary of State? Get out there and tell people about, get out there and, like, everyone you're looking at's going to hell. So you know what? Do something about that. But you don't really believe that, Mike Pompeo. You want power, you want influence, you want to dominate. And if we come back to patriarchy, we come back to purity culture, we come back to all of that, what's the impulse? The impulse is control. It's power.
You are so right. Well, and listening to your past podcasts, one thing that you've said that has really stuck out to me is that, like, if you are raised upon these values and this is what you believe, that time is of the essence, then why aren't we all out there acting as if it could all end tomorrow? That is, I didn't even get to quote all of the little quotes I'd pulled that I wanted to mention surrounding the pro-life movement in regard to the homeschooling community. But I mean, this is just such a packed topic, and we appreciate you taking even this amount of time to talk about it with us.
Yes, thank you.
I find it so important, and it's hard for me to separate the issues that I grew up as a homeschooler with politics and how they're trying to make it to where we are in this position of power to make these decisions, and that everything that our country was founded upon, this religious freedom, we're trying to just repeat what we came from. Like, how there's a reason that we had intended to have this separation. And now that's just what we're trying to return to. History repeats itself in a vicious cycle. And I don't understand how we haven't smartened up to that. It's just incredible.
Yeah, I think for me that it's a dark time. It's a very scary time. There's a lot of crisis every day. I think for me, I come back to this. There's more of us than them. It's not an insurmountable opposition. And ultimately, hope has more long-term potential for flourishing than fear. So if you live through Donald Trump's America, or you live through anything like it in terms of your local or church or community experiences like y'all had and like I had, there comes a point when you think to yourself, there's got to be something more than being afraid. And how can we construct a society or community or a church or anything else based on something else? And this election, I think, coming up here in a month, is really a referendum on that. You know, how much are we willing to sacrifice to instill that kind of vision rather than to give in to the fear mongering and the blatant desire for control and domination? That's it. And it's, don't get me wrong, nothing's guaranteed. I'm not one of these people who the arc of the universe bends towards justice and that just automatically happens. If it does do that, it's a very windy path. That arc is taking a very windy route to get to justice, and it only happens because people are willing to make it happen. It's not destined. And so anyway, for me, that's what's getting me through right now, and it's what's getting me to the place of being able to sleep at least a little bit every night.
Yeah, I love that.
Well, and in conclusion, so we don't take up all of your Sunday, I like this message of hope, and I think that, in my opinion, what's most important is that we all realize the power that we have as individuals, and we don't act out of fear, we act out of hope for better things. And we have to be as active as, I mean, just like we know that the right turns out in record numbers, like every elderly person that, you know, on the right, they vote they do not miss a vote. And we have to get this mentality that they have. We have to have this drive. We have to have people who are willing to do uncomfortable things and tell their truth and really get out there and take responsibility for making that positive change. And I think that's we're glad that you exist. And I'm still listening through I usually start at the beginning of a podcast and go all the way back, but I've kind of been bouncing back and forth. But the last thing I want to ask you is, I saw on your Twitter, which I've kind of gone on a hiatus up until like a couple months ago, where I was like off of social media, because I couldn't handle it. But I saw that you had mentioned something about Ben Shapiro. Please, Ben Shapiro is one of my number one people to hate, and I just want to know, where could you tell the story if there is one?
So I one of the things I've worked on in the past is a book on the history of the soulmate myth. Excuse me. Where did we get the idea of the soulmate? Well, the soulmate myth, if you think about it, is monotheism as monogamy, and monogamy conceived as monotheism. So your soulmate completes you. Your soulmate is you. Your soulmate gives you yourself for the first time, and your soulmate protects you from all invulnerability. Well, that sounds like Yahweh talking to Abraham. It sounds like Yahweh talking to Moses. It sounds like a monotheistic universe, right? Okay, so why am I talking about that? So in the course of writing this whole book about the history of the soulmate myth, I come across folks who are talking about being their own soulmate, right? So that's like Lizzo, and Emma Watson gave an interview where she said she's self-coupled, right?
I saw the piece you wrote on that and loved it.
Yeah, and so I write this whole thing for the New York Times about being your own soulmate, and I wasn't saying that's what you should do. I was saying, hey, here's how some folks are thinking about that, it's kind of interesting to think about, especially for women, to claim your identity and your independence and say, I'm my own soulmate. I don't want anyone else. Okay, that's a nice way to combat the patriarchal stuff we've been talking about today. Mm-hmm. And Ben Shapiro picked it up, got on his show, and just talked about how I'm just one more crazy liberal who wants to destroy the family. And this religion professor is and it's great. Like, my students found it, and they had a field day with this. It was really fun.
This is when you know you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, oh, that's what he said. I'm on track.
I will try and find this clip, but I can tell you that I have about a 10-second ability to listen to his voice before I lose it completely. So.
Don't just take my word for it. Don't. There's no need. Yeah, no need to do it.
Well, you're our hero, so thank you.
No. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for the work y'all are doing. I know for me, doing our show has been very healing, and it's given me a chance to kind of work through a lot of stuff from my own experiences and my own journey in ways that have been really helpful. And it's always nice to hear that they're helping others. And I know that, at least I hope that the two of you are having the same experience. Feeling like it's a positive thing for you, and you get to help other people in the meantime. So.
That's what we hope. And thank you so much. And hopefully we can speak again sometime.
All right.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Brad.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. All right, guys. Thank you for joining us today for our wonderful interview with Bradley Onishi. We were super excited to have him on the show, and we're extremely honored to speak with him on the topic of homeschooling, the Quiverfull Movement, and politics. And we would love to hear your comments, your ideas about these topics that we cover. Please go to our website, www.thefamilytiespodcast.com. Leave comments on our summary for this episode. And more importantly, we would really love it if you would hit subscribe. And then also, Julie, what else can they do?
You can go to the iTunes. I don't know what the icon looks like, but make sure to give us 5-star review.
5 stars.
5 stars. Hold on. Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, that's what I was doing with my hand.
Yes, please give us 5 stars. If you don't want to give us 5 stars, I respectfully request that you just don't put a review at all. Kelly's saying no, but honestly, the slightest change in stars ruins stuff.
Oh, yeah.
5 or nothing.
And
5 or nothing.
Julia, one thing I wanted to read out loud was a comment that was made on our religion episode. And we talked about how we were going to read them out, negative, positive. And that's what I'm going to do to close this out. Okay, let me get to it. Julie, you're so excited. You really should, because it's great. It's challenging, and it's definitely not short, but I was super excited to get it, and I want to read it to you all. Okay. This says, from Japanese Pumpkin, they say, "Hi, I'm from Japan, and I started to listen to the Family Ties podcast for English study. I came across your podcast while searching for John Oliver on podcasts. Your podcasts are interesting. Besides, I love your pronunciation very much. I want to pronounce like you, so I listen to you every day, again and again," which is super great. I love that. By the way,
she can't mean me because I fuck up all the words. She's got to be talking about just you, Kelly.
No. By the way, episode 17 was very interesting. I am a religious person, and I have found my own way to reconcile religion and science. I think both are different in purpose and methodology. If he or she is trying to learn English, this is written beautifully.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And he or she is referring to our episode 17, which is faith versus science. Anyways, so you know that there are different religious denominations in Christianity. Some believe in the Bible literally, and some interpret the Bible metaphorical way. Jesus said in the Bible, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees," Matthew 16. The disciples said, "It is because we didn't bring any bread." Jesus replied, "How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees?" Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast he used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. In another place, Jesus said, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me," John 6. Then many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching. Who can accept it?" And many of them no longer followed Jesus. Of course, Jesus didn't mean literally. He said, "The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life." He also said, "I am the bread of life." The Bible is full of difficult metaphors. The meaning will be revealed to you only when you read it with right purpose, I believe. So the purpose of science is to find the facts of the world, and the purpose of religion is to live to be a good person. I do believe in the virginity of Mary, but it is not the center of my faith. I can do without it very well. I mean, the most important part is love one another as I have loved you. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love, the Bible said. I believe that most scientific people are those who don't deny something which has not been proven. The methodology of science is to prove. The methodology of religion is to select. To select how you want to live, what kind of person you want to be, and thus to select the religion which matches best your wish. I was born in a Christian family, which gave me a lot of conflicts. I had a fear of the hell, and I didn't want to be a good person just because I want to go to the heaven. I also didn't want to look down on non-Christian friends who were much better than me. I once discarded my belief to be free. Then I thought, and finally have chosen to be a Christian. I have no fear now. I don't tell my children to go to church. They should choose for their own. I'm looking forward to listening to your new episode.
That is the perfect amount of challenging. I really respect that. Mm-hmm. And it's okay. It is perfectly okay for us to have different religious beliefs. And you know what? Is it Japanese Pumpkin?
Yes.
What was their username? Yes. Yeah. Japanese Pumpkin, you are correct. You know, it's so important to not dismiss other beliefs or other things just because it's not been proven yet, because you're right. Science is about proving, and it's about studying and
questioning.
Mm-hmm. So you're right. So I guess a lot of Kelley's and my discussions really stem from our personal experiences. So it is important that we're mindful of being more open, being 100% open. That doesn't mean that we agree with the religions, but I respect where you're coming from, and I really appreciate your openness to listening to where we're coming from. This dialogue's really important, and we're so grateful that, you know, you're able to be honest in such an eloquent and graceful way.
Yes, and eloquence. You were extremely eloquent. Your English is phenomenal. So I think you're actually superseding Julia and I both. You've surpassed us in how we speak our own language. So thank you once again, and we hope to get more comments so that we can keep reading them and discussing them. So please visit our site and rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, or rest of the week.
May it be filled with hope and not fear.
Hope and fear. Oh wait.
And not fear, Kelley.
Just hope. Hope, no fear.
Just hope.
Sorry. Can you tell I'm a little fearful about things right now? Hope. I need hope. We all need hope.
Hope.
Yes. All right. Thank you guys so much. We love each and every one of you. Join the family.
Join the family.
Bye.
Bye.